October 13, 1812. Nearly 4,000 U.S. soldiers are embarking to cross the Niagara River. On the opposite bank, they are opposed by only 500 British regulars, who at the current moment are completely oblivious to the threat. They stand as the only opposition between the U.S. Army and the capture of Upper Canada. Though despite outnumbering their enemy roughly 8-1, poor communication and discipline is about to meet the American invasion with disaster. Earlier in July, the American Army of the Northwest would be decisively defeated at Detroit, forcing the surrender of the vital stronghold and allowing the British to turn their attention toward the Niagara frontier. General von Rensselaer of the New York militia was initially unable to launch an attack across the river due to a lack of men and supplies. Despite this, British General George Prevost remained cautious. He was aware that days after the declaration, the British government had revoked the Orders in Council, America's main reason for the declaration. Prevost believed that negotiations might ensue and did not wish to prejudice talks by taking offensive action, critically allowing the poorly prepared Americans time to properly reinforce and supply their positions. By October, von Rensselaer's force consisted of roughly 2,500 regulars, 4,000 New York militia, and 160 Pennsylvania militia. Despite the failure at Detroit and the absence of any move against Montreal or Kingston, von Rensselaer was convinced his army possessed the strength to invade Upper Canada. He planned to leave from Lewiston and seize the heights near Queenston, directly across the river. Though after a previously failed attempt at crossing on October 11th, von Rensselaer would decide a second attempt would be made on October 13th. In the early morning of October 13th, von Rensselaer's force would begin their invasion. The first wave of boats would carry roughly 400 men, which von Rensselaer would lead personally. The invasion was supported by 2 6-pounder field guns under Lieutenant Colonel Winfield Scott, with an additional 2 18-pounders and a mortar placed on Queenston Heights in an earthwork named Fort Gray. Queenston was protected by 450 regulars and militia under the command of Captain James Dennis. A 9-pounder had been positioned near the guardhouse, and an 18-pounder and 8-inch mortar were positioned in a redan on Queenston Heights. A mile north of the village at Vrooman's Point were positioned a 12-pounder and 18-pounder cannonade. An additional 260 regulars and militia were based at Fort George, 10 miles to the north. Nearby was also an encampment of the Six Nations of the Grand River that could field 160 warriors, while at Chippewa to the south were an additional 250 regulars and militia. As the invasion force approached the narrow gravel beach, British guards quickly spotted the boats and opened fire before withdrawing to the village. As the Americans climbed the riverbank, they were met by a detachment of British regulars and militia. During the intense firefight that followed, von Rensselaer was hit in the thigh by a musket ball, then hit 5 more times in the heel, thighs, and calf. Although he survived, he would spend the rest of the battle out of action. Captain John E. Wool of the 13th U.S. Infantry quickly took over command, choosing to fall back to the beach, while Dennis withdrew to the village. Soon the British artillery opened fire on the boats and the landing point, making subsequent crossing attempts increasingly difficult, while the American artillery began returning fire in an attempt to silence the British guns. A number of boats carrying Lieutenant Colonel John Fenwick and 80 men landed at Hamilton's Cove at the northern end of the village. In an attempt to prevent the Americans from gaining a foothold, Captain Dennis quickly rushed troops to attack the isolated landing. After a short but intense firefight, it was clear the Americans were receiving the worst of it. With their boats' hulls perforated from musket fire, and many of their comrades killed or wounded, Fenwick's detachment quickly surrendered. With reinforcements, the Americans aimed to climb the heights and storm the redone battery. If successful, it would give them command of the village and landing zone. Without infantry to support the artillerymen, the engagement was short, allowing Wool to capture the redan with little resistance. At Niagara, British General Brock had been awoken by the noise of artillery at Queenston. Arriving shortly after dawn, the situation he found was beginning to deteriorate. Brock immediately dispatched a message to Major General Sheath at Fort George, ordering him to send reinforcements. Knowing the position was vital, Brock resolved to immediately launch a counterattack to retake the redan. Quickly assembling a body of men and placing himself at the head of the soldiers, he began his assault, leading them up the slope in a frontal attack against the earthwork. As the British force came under heavy fire, Brock was struck in the chest with a musket ball, killing him instantly. The British advance would fare little better than their commander, eventually being forced back by the withering American fire, where they were joined by Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald in a detachment of the 3rd York, before MacDonald would lead a second attempt to retake the redan. Unaware that the Americans had been reinforced, the regulars charged forward and began pushing the Americans back. However, the battle's momentum suddenly turned when MacDonald was hit in the back by a musket ball, causing him to fall from his horse. As the British attack faltered, the Americans launched a countercharge, sending the British force into disarray. As the British force routed, the Americans would take 21 prisoners. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Captain Dennis ordered his forces to abandon Queenston and fall back to the north. By mid-morning, the Americans were only opposed by the 12-pounder at Vermon's Point. With the lull in fighting, the Americans moved several hundred fresh reinforcements and a 6-pounder field gun across the river to Queenston Landing, then up to the heights. Meanwhile, American soldiers entered the village and began looting. After some miscoordination, Von Rensselaer asked Lieutenant Colonel Winfield Scott to take command at Queenston Heights. When Scott arrived, his command consisted of a collection of unorganized detachments, some without their officers. Similarly, some officers had crossed the river, but their men had refused to follow them. It is estimated that roughly 1,400 American soldiers had crossed in total. By late morning, British reinforcements had arrived at Durham's Farm from Fort George, under the command of Major General Sheath. A detachment of the Royal Artillery, with 2 6-pounders and a 5.5-inch howitzer, advanced on the village, supported by a company of the 41st, once again making it hazardous for the American boats to cross the river, as subsequent attacks on the village slowly began pushing the Americans back. At the same time, Mohawk warriors from the Grand River under John Norton had climbed the escarpment well to the west of Queenston and were approaching Scott's position from the south. Norton's contingent soon encountered American pickets, which quickly fell back before being reinforced by a body of infantry. Unwilling to mount a frontal attack, Norton withdrew back west. Fearing his troops might become encircled, Scott led several companies in a slow advance westward, halting to deliver volleys before entering the woods, engaging in a prolonged skirmish. Unable to properly launch an attack against the natives, Scott commanded his men to begin an orderly withdrawal back to their lines, while Norton continued to harass the Americans. In the aftermath of Norton's attack, a significant number of American soldiers began to abandon their posts, terrified at the sight of the dead and wounded and the war cries of the Mohawk. On the eastern shore, von Rensselaer was unable to convince a large portion of the militia to cross the river, dispatching a message to Scott, informing him of the predicament and leaving him the decision on whether to stand and fight or retreat back across the river. Scott's situation was becoming desperate. His troops were low on ammunition, and now with the British recapture of the town, he was entirely cut off from reinforcement, and any withdrawal meant the American forces would take heavy losses from the British guns, forcing Scott to remain on the heights. Meanwhile, British General Sheaffe had ascended the escarpment about a mile west of Queenston. His forces then circled around to the south, following the path that Norton had taken earlier, positioning the main body of his regulars facing north and directly in front of the American line, while his two light companies and Norton's Mohawks moved into position on his left. And after receiving reinforcements from Chippewa, he ordered them into position on his eastern flank. For the Americans, the situation had turned dire. Their position had been outmaneuvered. But with British control of the town and the cannons rendering any attempt at crossing the river costly, Scott was left with little option. He had to fight. Just after 3 p.m., Sheaffe gave the order to advance. His regulars moved within 100 yards of the American line, then volleyed en masse. The Americans volleyed in return before hurriedly beginning to pull back. The British continued to advance by platoon, firing volleys as they did. Meanwhile, the light companies and Mohawks moved quickly through the trees, firing upon the Americans from the west. While some of the Americans continued to make an orderly retreat toward the landing, others panicked and surrendered, or fell to their deaths trying to climb down the cliff. By the time the majority of the force reached the landing, they realized there were no boats, and escape was void. Quickly, the entire force surrendered, roughly an hour after the attack had begun. In the Battle of Queenston Heights, the British and Mohawk would suffer 21 killed, 85 wounded, and 22 captured, while U.S. forces would lose 70 killed, 80 wounded, and 955 captured. For the United States, the defeat was disastrous. Following the battle, von Rensselaer would turn over command of his remaining forces to Brigadier General Alexander Smith. For the U.S., disaster is looming, but the tides of war are about to change. Thanks to all the Patreons and members for making these videos possible.